Hello and welcome to this Astranti pre-scene information video analysis for the ACCA Strategic Business Leader Examination. In this particular video, and in this particular video series, I'm going to be looking through the pre-scene that has been given to us by ACCA, and I'm going to look at it in a holistic way, pulling out various bits of important information that you really need to be aware of going into your exam. Now, before we start, I'm just going to give an overview of what this video series will contain, the number of videos in it, and which videos are going to cover which specific pieces of content. So in this first video, which you are listening to right now, I'm going to cover the introduction and the airline industry information. Now, what I would say here, and ACCA has provided information to go alongside this pre-scene, is to not get ridiculously bogged down in all of the industry information. They have specifically said that they are giving this to you as background information, in a sense, advanced reference material, so that you have some context going into your exam. What they have said is they do not expect you to be an absolute industry egghead, industry genius, knowing everything there is to do with the airline industry. They have actively said that there is not a direct need for students to do a lot of further industry research outside of this pre-scene. So as we go through that particular section, looking at the airline industry, what I'll be doing is I'll be bringing up some key points and bringing up some potential issues that you need to be aware of. Perhaps there's going to be environmental issues with governments, with regulations. We're all aware of climate change. We're all aware of emissions and new regulations being brought in for emissions and what impact that is going to have on the airline industry. Also things such as cost changes, the cost of fuel increasing, and what impact that will have when kerosene prices go up. Also, what kinds of competitors are there within the industry? And what sorts of things might competitors do that will put a lot of pressure on Corjetz, for example? We'll then, in the second video, look at the overview of the organization. So in this particular section, what you'll find is information about the history of the organization, its structure, its makeup. You know from the SBL syllabus how important that is, how important it has to have the right structure to ensure effective movement, to stop strategic drift, etc. But also how the history of the company, the background of the company, the way the company has grown and expanded in the past is going to have an impact on the future. If they've grown through organic growth, then that is what's part of their makeup. If they've grown through aggressive acquisitions, that's part of their makeup, and so on. And that affects the strategies and the decisions being made going forward. We'll then look at the website extracts and the headline results and cost breakdown in video 3. And essentially, this is going to look at the mission and the values of the organization, how it cares about its stakeholders, and also its main results. And this is financial results, but this is also things like customer satisfaction, important metrics that you'll need to be aware of when it comes to answering questions in the exam. For example, if the passenger satisfaction is very low at the moment, and you are in the exam and you're being asked a question about pitching an increase in costs or an increase in prices to deal with the increase in costs, you might think, well, according to our most recent satisfaction, our passenger satisfaction is actually down at the moment. So is it really the right course of action, for example, to increase our prices and to cut down on our services when passenger satisfaction is already quite low? That's an example of how you would use that. But we also have a couple of additional other videos in this series as well. They just won't be looking specifically at this pre-seen document. They'll be using information from it, but we've prepared separate presentations to go through that information. And those are our strategic analysis. So this is looking at the various different, the most important models from the ACCA SBL syllabus. So you're thinking about things like SWOT, you're thinking about things like PESTEL, for example, 5 forces, and how they apply to Corjetz. So that will be our 4th video, and then our 5th video will be the top 10 key issues from the pre-seen. So once we've looked through all the pre-seen, once we've looked through that strategic analysis, we'll be highlighting what we feel are the 10 most important things from the pre-seen. So that is the contents of our video series, and really hopeful that you're going to find it really useful for getting a bit of context about Corjetz, a bit of context about the airline industry, and that will serve you really well going into your exam. So let's start by looking at the overarching introduction into this business, into this pre-seen, and also some information about the airline industry. The first thing that we can see is that Corjetz is a low-cost regional airline business. So what it means by low cost, again, if you want to think about this more contextually with the real world, then this would be quite similar to your EasyJet, to your Ryanair, ones that specialize in a no-thrills approach. And you can actually see that they've specifically used that phrase, no-thrills approach, there. And what that means is that everything is designed to be as cheap as possible. So things like the meals are not provided unless paid for separately. Also things like having the seat that you want. You might have to pay extra if you want a specific seat, if you want a window seat, if you want an aisle seat, etc. So all designed to basically provide passengers with a very, very cheap way of traveling from one country to the next, or one location to the next. Of course, a large country will have internal flights as well. And so initially we should already be thinking about, okay, what are the problems with running a low-cost business? Is there going to be naturally quite low passenger satisfaction because perhaps you're not putting much emphasis on the quality of the service? You are just competing by being the cheapest. Is that going to have an impact if things such as the fuel prices or the ground management charges, so the airport fees and things like that, if they were all to increase, are you selling enough cheap seats from a volume perspective to pay for all those costs? Also, think about competitor activity as well. One of the things that competing on price causes, if you think about your generic strategies, your porter generic strategies, whether you are competing on being a cost leader, whether you are competing on being differentiated, etc. The problem with being very low cost is that you don't gain any loyalty from your customers over the actual service you're providing. Their loyalty is to the cheapest airline. And if someone else comes along that's cheaper than you, then that can be problematic, that you can lose that passenger, lose that customer because they are cheaper than you. The company was established 20 years ago in Courland, and that's a country located on the continent of Hungary. And over the years, it's positioned itself as one of the world's leading low-cost airlines. It's currently the second largest low-cost airline operating in Hungary. So in terms of the entire continent, it's the second largest airline. Now that's very useful from a strategic perspective. It gives you prestige, it gives you power, it gives you the ability to perhaps impact the market, to impact the industry more than a small company would be able to. So perhaps you are more of a market leader and therefore people follow you, other companies follow you, rather than you having to react to competitors. And also, being such a large organization, there is a degree of prestige there, there is a degree of reputation there. there is also something that will help you to perhaps attract more staff, because there's the prestige, there's the perhaps security of working for a large company. Oh, Corjetz is a large company. It's not just going to collapse all of a sudden. There's job security there. That's not always the case, of course, but in terms of when you're looking to attract employees, that may be the case. And given that this is an industry that will have quite a heavy amount of staff involvement, quite a lot of manual processes, etc., there's likely to be thousands of staff employed by this company. So anything that's going to perhaps help you to attract and retain staff is going to be a positive. Also, from a financial perspective, I know that the SBL is not as much about the finance as some of the other modules within the ACCA syllabus, but it's also beneficial if you're a large company when it comes to attracting additional investment, when it comes to taking out loans, debt funding, or equity funding if needed. So those are all things that are positives of being a large organization. The downside, of course, of being a large organization, particularly in one such as this, an industry such as this, airlines, known for perhaps not being too great for the environment, that you are a very public organization. People are very aware of you, very aware of your operations. And so what shines brightly on the good parts of your business is also going to shine brightly on the bad parts of your business, or anything negative that is published about the company. And another point here, that in terms of passenger numbers, we're the second largest low-cost airline business. So that's a key metric to keep monitoring, because that's of course how you sell yourself as one of the largest companies in the world. So if your passenger numbers start to drop, then that's something that you need to look into, you need to try and reverse, because that is a key metric. That's part of what makes your business the second largest low-cost airline business in Hungary, and one of the world's leading low-cost airlines. Corjetz currently operates nearly 1,000 routes, so destinations, in over 30 countries across Hungary. Its head office is based at Near City Airport, which is located in the south of Courland. So Courland being the home country of it, where it was originally established. Now, the continent of Hungary is politically stable and economically developed. So again, when you're thinking about your Pestel analysis, politically, economically, there are less issues than there are perhaps with a developing country, which might be very unstable in terms of its politics, and also perhaps a lot of people don't have disposable income. Now, of course, for something like this, for an airline, holidaymakers, etc., it's very important that there is a reasonable degree of economic security from individuals within the country, where it's economically prosperous, because you're not going to be flying off all around the world, going on lots of holidays, if you are struggling financially and you can't afford the rent. So the fact that it's economically developed is obviously useful for it as an airline organization, because industries like this, they often follow the economy. When lots of people have lots of money and lots of disposable income, then airlines and the amount of flights and the amount of passengers go up. When there is a bit of a downturn, a recession, a depression, and lots of people don't have disposable income, then lots of people aren't flying to various destinations all around the world or all around the continent. And most of the countries in Hungary form a trading bloc, which facilitates free trade and free movement of people within it. So again, from a real-world context, this may be similar to Europe being a stable and economically developed continent, there being a trading bloc, the European Union, which facilitates trade and free movement. Now, of course, what does that immediately make you think of when you think of a trading bloc where it allows free trade and free movement? Well, what about Brexit? What if Courland were to do a Brexit, Corjetz, or whatever it might be? Then that would be a huge political factor that would have a real direct impact on the Corjetz business. If Corjetz was going to have to pay additional fees to continue to trade overseas, for want of a better term. It's not necessarily trading as such, but you know what I mean, to fly to different countries within Hungary, then that might cause a lot of problems. Also for staffing issues as well. If a lot of its staff come from other parts of Hungary to Courland, and then suddenly there is a lot stricter regulations with regards to immigration to and from Courland, then that could cause problems. Another thing that it mentions here is that each country has its own currency, with Courland's currency being the dollar. So again, that's another problem potentially from an economic perspective. If each of these countries has their own currency, then you are somewhat at risk from currency risk. You're at risk from translation risk. You're at risk from transaction risk. Because if the value of the Courland dollar were to fall quite dramatically versus other currencies within Hungary, then that could make it far more expensive to continue to do business overseas. If you are paying for airport slots at airports in Dorland or Poland or Lowland or whatever it might be, and the Courland dollar is super weak compared to those currencies, but they insist on being paid in the Dorland currency, then it's going to become very, very expensive for you to continue doing business in those countries. So that's a risk to factor in when you are analysing the pre-scene, when you are answering questions in the exam. The company currently operates a point-to-point service, which means directly from one destination to another rather than changing at a hub. So classic examples of hub airports would be things like the Netherlands airport, the Schiphol airport, which acts as a hub from a lot of flights coming in from Asia and North America, where people then change for other flights across Europe. Or Atlanta airport, where lots of flights from Europe, from Asia, etc., or Africa, they fly to Atlanta, and then they switch flights to fly to other parts of the United States or Canada. But they don't do that. They just fly point to point, which means if you're based in Courland and you want to fly to Dorland, you get on an airplane in Courland and you fly directly to Dorland. You don't have to take a airport transfer at any point to reach your destination. And this helps them to reduce their operating costs because they're not paying lots of slots at airports. They're not having to worry about whether if half the people get off at the hub and then there isn't another half of people to get on at the hub, which of course makes it more complicated, then they allow them to reduce their operating costs. And this approach means that things like in-flight meals are not included, and also includes a automation of a wide range of processes, including bookings, flight documentation, baggage drop, and flight check-in. So again, for things like EasyJet, Ryanair, you'll see that they have apps that you can have your boarding pass on it, you can check in ahead of time, and that saves time for people at the airport for starters, but it also just means that you don't have to employ so many people at the various different gates, at the various different checkpoints. So that's another important aspect there. And that also brings me on to an important point here, which is the idea of technology, the idea of automation. These are all important parts of the SBL syllabus. So one thing to be aware of is there potential advancements in technology or potential opportunities to automate things even further? So for example, certain organizations have started using, and certain airports, for example, started using electric buses. Now, of course, that's not automation, but it's a technological advancement that is cutting costs. So, and it's also helping the environment as well. Those shuttles that you use to take from the terminal out to where the airplane is. And it's likely that that's the kind of service that you'll have on Corjetz because, of course, it's much more expensive to park at the front of the terminal with the nice little air bridges that come out and people that walk on. That's something that's more reserved for the higher end services. The low-cost airlines, you usually have to get out of the terminal and take the shuttle bus to the tarmac where the plane is parked and walk up those rickety staircase things that they have. So the idea of technology, the idea of automation, further automation is an important point here. And there's perhaps other things that can be done, other processes that could be automated. Another point you might be thinking, looking through this as well, is that if the no-frills approach of the low-cost airline model is suffering, is there any opportunity for perhaps new forms of service, such as having the more high-end service, or having a first class, having a business class, etc. And that's a valid point, but it's not that simple, because of course the whole purpose of this enterprise is the low-cost, no-frills approach. So it would perhaps potentially dilute the brand to start having that as well, the cost of implementing. And also, everyone that already books business class, books first class, etc., probably has airlines that they go to, that they are more loyal to. They might look down on the Corjetz name, and just the fact that you're suddenly offering it isn't going to make them want to do it. So what organizations often do, and this is if you were given such a question, if you were to sort of pitch it in the exam, is that they often use a sub-brand. Now, a classic example of this, particularly in the car world, is Lexus. Lexus is seen as a very, very high-end automobile, but it's actually just a Toyota. Same for Audi. It's actually just a Volkswagen. But they use this separate branding to make it a completely separate brand that is then separated, distinct from the parent brand, and they can market it in a different way. The two don't get confused as much. So that's potential outlook for that, potential way of implementing that should you suggest it in the exam. So as you can see, we've only just looked at the first few paragraphs, and there's quite a lot of points that we should already be looking at, thinking about going forward, thinking about what kinds of opportunities are there for this organization, what kinds of problems could they face. With greater automation comes greater threat to cybersecurity and things breaking down. The website's not working, the booking system's not working, the documentation not working, etc. Also, we know that there's a lot of staff involved. We know that there's a lot of big heavy machinery involved. So what about staffing issues? What about health and safety concerns? All these things we're already starting to think about before we move on to the rest of the pre-scene. And move on to the rest of the pre-scene we shall, looking at the airline industry information. So this is things that aren't specific to Corjetz at all. This is just the general background information that ACCA wants you to be aware of when you enter the exam, just so that you have a bit of knowledge about it. You don't have to be an expert, as I mentioned, but you don't look at it and think, I don't know the first thing about the airline industry. What even is an airline? You have enough information about the sorts of passengers, the sorts of services offered, so that you can answer it with a bit of context. So let's take a look. The airline industry encompasses a wide range of businesses, normally called airlines, which offer an air transport service to customers. So it's air transport. It's not necessarily about passengers or anything like that. It's an air transport service to customers. So that can mean all manner of things. That can mean passengers. It can mean specific private flights, military flights. It can mean cargo flights as well. So there's lots of things that it could mean. Now, of course, we know at the moment they are a no-frills passenger airline. So again, we're already thinking about other potential services. Could they do? Could they have some contracts with the military? Now, of course, there's an ethical perhaps implication there. Perhaps the military wouldn't trust them anyway, and there's a big government contract in that instance. Is there even a need for it? Also cargo as well. Are there other organizations that are already big within that industry that would make it prohibitive to try and get into that market? So, for example, companies like FedEx, companies like DHL, huge logistics companies run a lot of their own cargo airlines already. They're already integrated into the supply chain, which would mean breaking into that market difficult. Now, you might think, well, why am I saying all of this? I'm just giving you things that you could use, arguments that you could make, points that you could raise if such a question were to arise in the exam, how you would go about talking about it, what kinds of problems, if you dissect the strategy, the idea, the plan, what kinds of problems can you find within it? So, normally referred to commercial airlines, these businesses offer scheduled commercial flights which carry both human passengers and cargo, in most cases carried out using jet aircrafts. Commercial flights are those which transport passengers from one destination to another with a pre-booked ticket. And non-commercial flights are either operated privately or by the military. So again, just more information about other types of flights that take place within the airline industry. So again, potential options for new services should the need arise. The airline industry forms just one sector of the wider aviation industry, which also includes other aviation-related businesses such as jet engine suppliers, aircraft manufacturers, and aerospace companies. So again, when you're thinking about potential opportunities, supply chain and sort of helping out with the supply chain and streamlining the supply chain, you've got organizations that then buy the jet engines, then produce the planes, then sell them to the airline companies. The airline companies then, of course, sell seats to passengers, and also an important customer of an airport will be an airline company as well. The airports themselves are run separately, and airlines will pay to be able to land at their airport, for example. But it would be very difficult to suggest something like an integration, a horizontal integration within the rest of the industry, because it would be very difficult to just become an aircraft manufacturer, to become a jet engine supplier. It would be more likely that you would have some sort of agreement, some sort of merger in place, rather than try to enter that industry or anything like that. The airline industry directly and indirectly supports global trade, tourism, and economic growth. So, of course, there is a direct aspect in that when the airlines do well, the profits are taxed, and that tax goes into the public system, etc. Also, directly supporting it by shipping goods from one location to the other, shipping people. Also, indirectly, the more tourists that go to a particular city, the better those businesses within that city are going to benefit from all the tourism, etc. So, it has a positive impact on the global economy and also on many other industries, because it essentially allows for the world to be much smaller. If you are a particular manufacturer of a food good or a physical good, etc., in one particular country, but it was quite a small country, and it was quite a poor country, wasn't that many people to buy your product, the fact that you can send it all the way around the world via aircrafts means that it's going to have a huge benefit for your business. So it's a very important industry for the global economy, which means that there's a risk of it becoming more of a politicized industry, but also one that will be protected by politics as well, because governments, businesses won't want the airline industry to fail. Various different passenger types as well to be aware of within the industry. You've got your typical leisure passenger, someone traveling on a holiday to stay in a hotel or a holiday resort. Also, you have business passengers, someone that's going from England to America, from Corland to Dorland for business. So they're going for work purposes, maybe to attend an international conference or to attend a meeting with a potential supplier, potential buyer, etc. And both types of passengers may be offered the chance to travel first class, business class, or economy class by some airlines. Now, of course, given that we are a low-cost industry, a no-thrills approach, generally everything is pretty much economy class. You don't go for a no-thrills first-class approach. It's the absolute opposite. First class is all thrills. And also, first class attracts a very, very, for want of a better term, high caliber of clients, someone who has a lot of money. The difference is the average cost between economy, business class, and first class is enormous. First class aimed primarily people who have so much money that it actually doesn't matter how much they pay for it. They'd rather just have a better experience. So, for example, the average cost of an economy flight for a transatlantic flight might be about £700-800. Business class, about £1,200 to £1,500. And then first class will suddenly jump to £10,000. Because it's for people who have so much money, it makes no difference. Now, again, we did speak about whether that would be potential other services that could be provided by the organization, but again, that first class client isn't going to want to go on a no-thrills airline. It completely defeats the point. They want the thrills approach. They want the first class experience. So again, maybe not the right sort of strategy for us to undertake unless it were to be through a sub-brand as previously discussed. First passengers pay significantly more for their ticket, but in return receive a high quality service, including dedicated airport lounges, large comfortable in-flight seats, and unlimited food and drink provided throughout the flight. Business class pay less than third class, but they receive a lower level of service. Economy pays the lowest amount, and the economy price is usually quite cheap. But on a standard airline does often include a seat, limited leg room, and limited in-flight food options, whereas we, at the moment, arguably it's a sub-economy offering. It doesn't necessarily even offer a standard seat, or you have to pay extra for a specific seat. In the same way with Ryanair, EasyJet, you have to pay if you want to select a certain seat. And also you have no in-flight food options without paying for it separately. So that's just an overview of the various different types of passengers you have for an airline. What about the different types of service? Well, you've got three here: international, national, and regional. So a national airline is one that offers services within a country. So, for example, if it was a Courland national airline, it would be one that only flies from destinations within Courland. You then have a regional one which provides specific regions. Now, this is where Corjetz is. It's a regional airline. It just focuses on flights in Hundia. It's just a continental airline. Now, the biggest one is the international airline. The international airline, these are the largest airlines in the world. They fly all over the world. So they need a huge variety of planes to achieve this. So, for example, another reason why companies like EasyJet, Ryanair are quite similar to this is they are regional. They're not national by any means. They fly all over Europe. They even fly to places like North Africa, etc. But it's still very much within a region. They don't fly to Japan. They don't fly to Canada, etc. Now, of course, it would be very expensive to fly that far, and it would be very difficult for them. They wouldn't be able to have the flights going back and forth all day in the same way that they do in European destinations. So, because the pilots need a certain amount of time in between flights. So, that would perhaps not be a valid strategy for a company like EasyJet, for a company like Ryanair. Also, they need bigger planes. You cannot fly all the way across the Pacific Ocean, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean on a small two-engine jet. You usually need a four-engine jet, or at least one of the very, very modern large two-engine jets, such as the Dreamliner and planes like that. So you need a much bigger range of planes. And you need to have that range because an international airline will also offer the regional and the national airlines, generally. And of course, you don't want to be, if you're flying from London to Scotland, you don't want 50 people on a Boeing 747 flying from London to Scotland, because it would be a huge waste of money to do that. It would cost you far more than you'd make from selling those seats on the flights. And also a large plane like that needs a larger runway. For example, again, a UK reference, Bristol Airport is an airport that does fly to lots of destinations all across Europe, North Africa, etc., but doesn't fly to North America, to Asia, because the runway is not long enough or wide enough to support a large four-engined aircraft. So if they were to expand to new routes, which is a far more likely, perhaps, thing for you to suggest than to expand into the first class market or to expand into the cargo or military market, they would need serious investment, because they would need to have more hubs across the world, which of course would mean open them to more translation transaction risk, particularly as those will be centers for business. So when everything is carried back to Courland, there might be transaction differences. And also just the sheer cost of doing all that, and the sheer cost of purchasing all these new aircrafts. And of course, whether they would then buy them outright, whether they would lease them, etc., and the various different advantages and disadvantages that come with each of them. So now on to the airline types by business model. So of course, we know from what we've seen so far that here at Corjetz we are a low-cost carrier. Now, low-cost carriers gain their advantage by reducing costs. Again, the same way as EasyJet, same way as Ryanair, much cheaper, and able to perform ultimately the same service, albeit a much more limited service, for a lot less. And they often fly to smaller and less popular airports where the landing and ground handling fees are cheaper. So that classic example of an organization, an airline that wants to fly someone to Paris and stops at an airport that's 50 miles away from Paris, etc. That's essentially what low-cost carriers are. And for customers, they're generally significantly cheaper because things like baggage allowances and in-flight meals won't be included in the price of the ticket, which means you can pay extra for them, but you perhaps don't want to actually have them. So, for example, if you were to go to another city on a city break for a long weekend, and you could fit what you needed in a carry-on case or in a backpack or something like that, why would you pay extra for hold luggage when you won't actually need any hold luggage? So it's really great for people making those sort of short haul, smaller trips for shorter periods of time. But it does say that some low-cost carriers do actually offer business class services. So again, we don't know if Corjetz does or not at this time, but there again is a potential opportunity maybe to have not first class but business class, maybe the front of the aircraft just slightly nicer for a slightly higher price. Still a lot less than, say, business class on a full service carrier, but gives people who want to pay less still the option to have just a bit more luxury in their flight. Now, this of course is different from a full-service carrier, so this would be your British Airways, for example, type company that offers a range of pre-flight and on-board services, such as checked luggage, in-flight meals, airport lounges, and offers first class as well as business and economy class, and these can be all across the world. So you can have a national, but you can also have an international longer haul flight full service carrier as well. Then you have a couple of extra ones. So you've got the cargo airlines. So I've already spoke about cargo airlines and often they're subsidiaries or subdivisions of airlines. So that's a key phrase. It's exactly what I've been speaking about, is having a subsidiary, a subdivision, not having your Corjetz cargo airlines, having a subsidiary underneath it so that you can maintain your typical standard business to consumer, business to passenger branding, but you can then have a subsidiary that deals with cargo airlines. So the fact that they have specifically said that cargo airlines are subsidiaries or subdivisions is telling to potentially how these airlines operate when they operate across multiple services, whether that's having a subsidiary cargo airline, whether it's having a subsidiary charter airline, whether it's a subsidiary one that's more premium, for example. And charter airlines, these are specific ones for specific destinations. So these often are sold to tour operators. They're not scheduled flights. They're not flights that are happening at 9 o'clock from this airport every day or this airport at 10 o'clock every other day. They are specific airlines that are sold. The tickets are sold by tour operators. So this would be your TUI, for example, TUI, or your Thomas Cook before, of course, it all collapsed, where you have a situation where they sell flights, they sell package holidays with the hotel, the airport transfers. You go along with everyone else who's staying at various different hotels on that same island, that same country. You all go on the plane, you all get on the bus afterwards, and you all go to the different hotels. So again, that would often be operated either as a subsidiary or it would be a travel company rather than a specific airline organization. It's one that is perhaps part of that tour company or has exclusive contracts with that particular tour company. So various different types of competitors. We have ones that will be very specific direct competitors to us, such as low-cost carriers, or you will have ones that will be more along the lines of substitute competitors that do the same job, but they do it they're not directly competing with. So full service carrier is a competitor, but it's not a direct competitor. Someone is flying on a full service carrier, they are not going to be flying on a Corjetz plane. So they're still somewhat a competitor, but we are not competing directly with them in the marketplace. We're going after a different customer that wants a different service. On to the next page now, just a brief explanation as to what the difference is between a hub and spoke model and a point-to-point model is. Now, we know from what we've seen in the pre-scene so far that Corjetz operates a point-to-point travel. Now, point-to-point travel is, as the diagram says, it's where you have a company that flies from one point to another point. Whereas a hub and spoke is one that flies to a particular hub destination and then flies out from that destination, or flies to and from a specific airport. And it says here that airlines which operate a hub and spoke model fly from one airport into a hub airport, which passengers then take a flight from a connecting hub to their final destination. And that's the example I mentioned about airports like Amsterdam Airport, airports like Atlanta Airport, where they're often a hub for people that are going elsewhere. You fly in from Asia to Amsterdam Airport and you get a connecting flight from Amsterdam to Spain, for example, rather than flying directly from Asia to Spain. Airlines operate this model because it allows them to offer more flights to passengers and designed to optimize the airline's network coverage. Because, of course, if you are flying into a hub and then out elsewhere, then it gives you a time to refuel, it gives you a time to fly to further destinations, it gives you another base to fly to different areas from. If you were having to fly from, let's say this again was in Asia, let's say it was in China, and you had to fly not to a hub in Europe, but you had to fly to individual airports in Europe every single time, and you had to fly back that exact same way every time as well, it would be more limiting in your international coverage. So particularly with regards to international airlines, it would be commonplace to have a hub, a major hub in the various different continents. So again, if Corjetz were to start looking at potentially doing this, not only would they need new aircraft, they would need a hub. They would need to source a hub airport in the major continents. The alternative to this route is the point-to-point model, where the airline focuses on providing passengers with a route from the origin to final destination. Now, of course, there's no need to connect passengers to this through a hub airport, and particularly if they're scheduled flights, then flights operate directly between the cities. This model has proved popular with airline customers in recent years, and most of the low-cost airlines operate this model. And you can understand why it would be beneficial to the customers, because, of course, who really wants to do an airport transfer? Who wants to get off a plane into an airport and then spend more time waiting in an airport before your connecting flight? So that's why it's very useful for customers. We have some important statistics here, and what I think this shows is the prominence of Hundria within the airport market. So you can see here that we've got 600 million people transported. So again, a key metric, 600 million every single year flights throughout Hundria. And this compared to the 3 billion that is global. So that's quite a significant percentage, really. You think about that, that is 20% of all flights in the world are passengers traveling in and around Hungary. And I've also done that same calculation for the average number of commercial flights per day and passenger revenues, and they pretty much are all around that 20% mark. I know it's got 21% there, but that even then that was rounded up from about 20.54%. So it's quite a specific percentage of the global marketplace. But what that does show you when you are thinking about new services, you're thinking about the general economic environment, the business environment, which of course are all very important parts of the SBL syllabus, is there is still a wealth of industry that Corjetz can still get a piece of. Because actually it's limiting itself at the moment to a marketplace which is only 20% of the global market. So by expanding into the international trade, then it will perhaps be able to take more out of that market share. And again, when you think about the history of this company, it's been around 20 years, it's second largest one in Hungary, it's one of the world's leading low-cost airlines. They have experience with the market, with the low-cost market. So in other continents around the world, perhaps there isn't that experience. And you think about your Porter's Diamond, that knowledge that you've built up in your home market can give you an edge on the perhaps less developed organizations within different markets. And just another point there, that's why not be a multi-regional airline rather than an international airline? And what I mean by that, and that's something that's not necessarily been explored in the pre-scene yet or spoken about, is this idea of replicating this point-to-point in each continent. It's worked very, very well in Hungary. Rather than just assuming that as an international airline we'd have to go for a hub-and-spoke approach, maybe we aren't an international airline, maybe we are multi-regional, as in we have a whole regional business in Hungary. We have a whole regional business replicating the Hungary business model in a different continent, and so on. So it's slightly different than an international, but it may be an easier way to expand into that market without altering our business model, which has proven so successful. Because we can replicate it in a different continent, rather than having to go into the international airline market, which is different. We're just replicating our regional model in a different region. So another opportunity for the company there. Now we move on to flight management activities. So these are services that we as an airline pay for through airport fees. So for example, when you're landing at the city airport in Courland, you're paying the city airport fees. You're paying to use their staff, their services. In a sense, they are a supplier of ours, or we are a customer of theirs. We are paying for air traffic control. We're paying for aircraft ground handling. So this is, of course, important. The bigger the airport, the bigger the supplier power in that instance. If we've got a huge airport that we need to deal with, and they put their prices up, they put their costs up, then they might have to force us to pay that higher price because we can't afford to not land at that airport. That would be instrumental to our operations or detrimental to our operations. So these are, depending on the size of the airport, the power of the airport, these will be important players. They will be important suppliers of ours. And so air traffic control, I'm sure you're all aware of what that is. It's the people in that big tower with all the computers that ultimately control the airspace, making sure that planes can arrive safely, planes can take off safely as well. And that's very important. They're obviously a very, very powerful stakeholder there. We can't go against what air traffic control is saying. And air traffic control ultimately it's not necessarily just that airports, it's a big network because they all need to communicate with each other, of course. And of course, we don't want to do anything that breaches any rules or regulations enforced by ATC, because that, of course, could lead to huge fines. It could lead to huge health and safety issues. It could lead to a huge damage to our reputation as well. And other airport services include the ground handling. So things such as people at the gate, people at the baggage management, making sure the passenger baggage is loaded, offloaded correctly, that the same luggage is then loaded onto the aircraft effectively, and the shuttle bus services between the airport and the aircraft, which of course I've already mentioned. Refueling services as well. Now, refueling, that's an important one there, because the price of kerosene is obviously very linked to the price of crude oil. And crude oil is a very politicized commodity. And also it is something that can go up and down quite a lot. It's very volatile. So we are also tied in with the economic impact of, or the perhaps the political landscape with regards to oil as well. If something happens and causes the oil price to spike, such as problems in the Middle East or something like that, and that's going to have a massive impact on our business. And one here that we may not have direct control over, but could be beneficial to us, would be if there was further automation, further technological advancements, again, referencing your pestel there, with things like security checks, baggage scanning, passport control. All of those things that are carried out manually at the moment, but could be done more automated. They've already brought in more automatic passport control. You've probably been into those self-service things where you have to scan your passport, look at a camera, and it then looks at you. You may have gone through the airport security where you stand in the little cubicle with your arms up, and then it says whether there's any metal on you or anything like that. So it's a lot easier than having all the metal detectors and then the scannings. For example, one day when you look at those big queues in the airport, what if there was a certain segment within that queue that was just basically one big long scanner, and you're walking through it like a tunnel? You've probably seen on films before, in high-tech things where people walk through little tunnels and it scans them while they're walking through the tunnels. And then you could just have people walking through at a reasonable pace in single file, and just one way it's like, oh, that person's got a piece of metal on them there, let me just pull them out of the line for a quick check. And maybe that would increase the automation, cut down on the amount of personnel, but also have the same effect in terms of the level of security. And that might be beneficial for all parties involved, and if that cuts a lot of costs in airport security, then perhaps the airport will pass that on as a cost saving. Now on to industry challenges now. And we've already discussed quite a few of these. We've already discussed the idea of the economic impact of when people have a lot of money, they're more likely to go on holiday. When people have less money, less likely to go on holiday. We've already spoken about fuel being one of the biggest costs for the organization. So things like the kind of demand being cyclical, demand for flights being driven by economic growth. Then, of course, that's something that we have already discussed, and it's actually been beneficial for us because we've taken increased market share by offering a more affordable, low-cost air travel. And this has made air travel more accessible globally, and also it's one of those things, why would you just pay more? Even if you could afford to pay more, why would you pay more? If you're going on a 1-hour flight to a different country for a 3-day city break, why would you pay £400 for a ticket when all you're doing is going to be sitting on a plane for an hour, not wanting to eat, taking on nothing but a backpack? Why would you pay £400 when you could pay £100 for a slightly less good service? So there's more logic in why people are doing it rather than just economic growth as well. Another one we've discussed is the fuel. Fuel being one of the biggest costs for airlines and also the most volatile, represents over 20% of most airlines' cost. Because the price of the fuel is correlated to the price of crude oil, which I've already mentioned, and that's been very volatile for 5 years. They're also very prone to foreign exchange movements. Now, of course, I've already mentioned that as well. foreign exchange risk, translation risk, transaction risk. These are things, the big risks for this company, and will be further risks if they do decide to expand more to other routes, other destinations. And of course, another thing that is very prominent is the environment. We all know about climate change. We've all heard a lot about that. We've all heard about the airline's impact on it. So that is a big factor as well, environmental factors. Are we doing anything, any kind of corporate social responsibility plan or anything like that to perhaps counteract our carbon footprint, to counteract our carbon emissions? At the moment, we haven't seen anything like that. Might be something that is worth doing for our reputation, for our impact on the environment, particularly if governments bring in regulations about reducing climate change. Cybersecurity as well, it's an important part of the SBL syllabus. Cybersecurity, making sure you've got the best systems in place, making sure you have tested those systems, making sure you are auditing those systems as well. There is a real-world example. British Airways had their systems attacked as well. That's an airline that had it attacked, and it caused lots of problems for them. And adverse weather events could cause problems. We saw recently with all the wildfires in southern Europe and the issues that caused with flights getting in and out of the country as well. All of these things are increasing, and we need to have controls in place or mitigative steps in place. So you think about your TARA model, etc., from the syllabus, to deal with these issues should they arise. And unfortunately, the airline industry is some way off of operating aircraft with alternative fuels such as biofuels, and they're still reliant on crude oils. I mentioned about operating in a greener way and finding alternatives to do that, whether that is through corporate social responsibility projects, maybe that's by electric buses at the airports as well, or reducing other factors in the airline operations process as well, even if you can't change the fuel. And to be fair, are people going to want to do that? If you said, oh, we're going to be a solar powered plane, it might fall out of the sky if the sun goes in. Are you going to want to do that? Are you wanting to trust an electric plane that has much limited range compared to one that uses fossil fuels? Again, it's a reputation, and trust in those sorts of things will take even longer than the technology will. But it will need to invest significantly in alternative fuel sources. So whether that is the airline's responsibility at this point, whether that's the airline or aeroplane manufacturer's responsibility at this point, the jet engine manufacturers, or maybe it's all of us coming together. And so I've mentioned about the carbon footprint. There's a statistic there about it. 3% of global emissions come from airline travel, and that is causing people to consider alternatives. So again, maybe if we show that we offset our impact and therefore they aren't contributing to global emissions by flying with Corjetz, that will be a positive selling point for us. But despite these concerns, they actually increased to 5% in the last year, with international air traffic control struggling to cope with the increasing flight numbers. And this is evidenced by the rise in delays of nearly 20%. So this is a big worry as well. This is going to directly lead to passenger dissatisfaction. And actually, it's not necessarily to do with us, it's to do with air traffic control. Because they won't see that, they'll see it as the airline being late. So whether there are ways in which we can improve our own processes, make the cleaning and the turnaround of the planes, for example, to be far quicker so that we don't miss our flight slots, which means we won't get delayed. It could also mean that we purchase better flight slots. Now, of course, that will be potentially expensive to do so, because once we've bought the flight slots, we'll need to ensure that we can fill it. We'll then need to potentially sell our existing flight slot, but it could be that the new one is more expensive. So, for example, to park at Gate 1 at a major terminal, a major airport, and fly at the most popular time for flying is going to be far more expensive than parking at the gate that's the furthest possible one away from the terminal at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's essentially what a flight slot is. They are divvied up and they are sold by the airport to particular airlines. And if you miss your flight slot, then your flight might be delayed. And does explain that in that footnote at the bottom there. And the final part of this video before we move on to the Corjetz overview is just a bit of information about the key performance indicators. Now, as SBL students for ACCA, these are going to be really important. Now, we haven't been given the actual figures or anything yet, so there's not really anything we can do with it, but it's important that we are aware of them, because you might be asked questions about, for example, how we can improve our image, or how we can measure how efficient our airline is operating at, how can we measure our damage and our impact on the environment, etc. And so they've given us a few things to be aware of here, such as the ask. And it's also important that you remember these acronyms here, because they might just be given to you as those acronyms in the exam rather than the full title. So the ask is the available seat kilometers. That's calculated by taking the number of seats available and multiplying it by the distance flown. It's a measure of airline capacity. So if you've got 100 flights with 100 seats and you fly 100 miles each day, then that is how you calculate it. You have the revenue. But that's more about your performance here. It's calculated by dividing the airline's total revenue by its total ask, which of course is the available seat kilometers, and it's a measure of potential revenue generation. And so, of course, the more seats that you have available, then perhaps the higher that you're going to, also the more revenue that you have, versus the lower your ASK is, the more essentially efficient you are. If you have low revenue as a portion of your available seat kilometers, then perhaps that's suggesting that you have lots of empty seats because you're not generating much revenue per seat kilometer. You then have a few more that are linked to the number of passengers. So we've got the load factor. So again, that would be an example of utilization, with the percentage of checked-in passengers in relation to the available seats. So if you've got 100 seats on an aircraft and you, on average, only have 70 people on that plane, then it's only operating at 70% of utilization. It's perhaps inefficient. And if you've got that enough times, then it might be worth considering whether you have fewer flights. If, say, you've got a flight from one destination to another destination, you do that 3 times a day, and each one is only 50% full, would it be better to run 2 flights a day, and then all those people would just be spread between those 2 flights, and you'd have 2 flights with much higher load factors? And that would be, of course, more efficient, because it means not paying for a flight slot, it means not paying for the fuel for 3 flights, etc. So that's how you might use that statistic. Then have the revenue passenger kilometers, and that's calculated with the number of passengers multiplied by the total distance travelled, which is the number of kilometers travelled by paying passengers, who are referred to as revenue passengers. And then another one here, which will be useful when you're thinking about your impact on the environment. Again, another reason to have a better utilization, because the more passengers that you have, the lower your CO2 per passenger will be, because the plane will not necessarily produce that much more CO2 if it's got 100% capacity versus 20% capacity. But the CO2 per passenger will be significantly lower if it is full. And another one here that's really crucial just for you as an organization, for Corjetz as an organization, that a higher percentage of flights that land on time is better for its reputation, better for its customer satisfaction, and lots of other factors like that. And also that may also affect the relationship with the airport and with air traffic control, because if your planes are always late, then that's going to mess up all their other operations. And the final thing we need to be aware of before moving on to the Corjetz portion of this video series is there is an industry body. There is a global trade association, and that is to formulate industry policy and support airline activity. So it promotes awareness of the benefits of which the airline industry brings to national global economies and also to develop global standards. So essentially, it provides airline safety and security in setting defined rules. So this is a regulatory industry body. So very important stakeholder, the kind of ones that you need to keep satisfied, ones that have a high power, perhaps low interest on what you're doing day to day, but they would have a lot of power over you if you were perhaps to breach their rules. And it's expected that all companies will be part of this, and we should be an active member of that because they help set policy. And of course, we want to be setting policies that are going to be beneficial for us. I don't mean that in an unethical way, but just in a, we want to be a leading company with regards to setting policies. So very important stakeholder there, and something that we will need to keep satisfied. And again, another stakeholder we can add to our list of stakeholders. Of course, managing stakeholders and satisfying the needs of stakeholders, very, very important part of the ACCA SBL syllabus. So that brings us to the end of this first video looking at the industry. We started to bring up quite a few potential things from the pre-scene here. Quite a few opportunities maybe for the company, some key risks for the company such as cybersecurity, health and safety, etc. We looked at potentially a multi-regional approach to expanding to different parts. We also looked at risks such as foreign exchange risk and fuel rate risks as well. New services, potentially offering a business class or a cargo line, but then obviously making sure that it's subsidiary because we don't want it to affect our brand, and we don't want to then muddy our strategy as well. Having a consistent and strong strategic direction for the company, of course, being very important. You know that from your SBL syllabus. And also factors such as the environment, whether that's the government or whether that is the economic situation as well. All these things from the general business environment were important. So thank you for watching, and please join me for the next video where we're going to be looking at Corjetz specifically. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you have found it useful. If you did enjoy this video and you want to see more of it, or if you are studying for the September 2023 exam for the ACCA Strategic Business Leader, then please do visit our website www.astranti.com. We have a free ACCA SBL pre-scene pack that includes all 3 videos for the pre-scene analysis, the strategic analysis, and the top 10 pre-scene issues. In addition to that, we also have our industry analysis document going through the airline industry and 2 ACCA SBL mock exams with complete solutions for you to practice ahead of the exam. And also, you have access to our SBL discussion board, so you and fellow students like yourself in the same position studying for this exam will be able to chat, will be able to ask questions and receive answers from our tutors. And the best part is all of this is completely free. In order to access this, please click the link in the description or visit the website www.astranti.com and sign up for our free ACCA SBL resources now. So thank you again for watching this video, and do check out that website for more free content.